In 1985, Stroh Brewery Company was the third largest beer producer in America. 5,000 workers clocked in every day at breweries in Detroit, Tampa, Memphis, and Winston-Salem. Good union jobs, middle-class wages, benefits, pensions, the kind of manufacturing work that built the American middle class. The Stroh family had been brewing beer in Detroit for 136 years, 5 generations. Workers whose grandfathers had worked for Stroh's, whose fathers had worked for Stroh's, who expected to retire from Stroh's and watch their own kids get hired. And then, in less than 15 years, it all disappeared. By 1999, Stroh's was gone. The breweries were closed. 5,000 jobs gone. The workers who'd spent 20, 30, 40 years building that empire were told to go home. The family business that had survived everything, wars, economic collapse, prohibition, couldn't survive the beer wars of the 1980s and 90s. But here's what makes Stroh's collapse different from every other American brewery that failed. Stroh's didn't die from bad beer. They didn't die from changing consumer tastes. They didn't die slowly from decades of declining sales. Stroh's died from ambition, from one catastrophic decision made in a Detroit boardroom in 1982. The Stroh family bought a collapsing rival brewery, the number 2 beer in America, for over $500 million. Money they didn't have, a company they couldn't fix. It was supposed to make them a powerhouse that could compete with Anheuser, Busch, and Miller. Instead, it buried them in debt they'd never escape, and it cost 5,000 workers everything. This is the story of Stroh's, the Detroit brewing empire that bet everything on one massive acquisition and lost. Chapter 1. The Fire-Brewed Legend. The Stroh story begins in 1850, when a 28-year-old German immigrant named Bernhard Stroh stepped off a ship in New York with almost nothing, just his clothes, some borrowed money, and a brass kettle containing his family's secret, a brewing recipe from Germany that had been passed down for generations. Bernhard made his way to Detroit. The city was small then, just 21,000 people, but it was growing fast. German immigrants were pouring in, looking for work in the new factories springing up along the Detroit River. And German immigrants meant one thing: a market for German beer. Bernhard started brewing in a small copper kettle in the back of a rented building. The method he brought from Germany was called fire brewing. Instead of heating the brew kettle with steam, like most American breweries, Bernhard used direct flame, an open fire underneath a copper kettle. It was more dangerous, more difficult to control, but it caramelized the malt sugars in a way steam heating never could. The beer had a richer, slightly sweeter flavor that Germans recognized immediately. It tasted like home. By 1860, Bernhard had saved enough to build a proper brewery. By 1865, he was producing 500 barrels a year. By the time he died in 1882, Stroh's was one of Detroit's major breweries, known throughout the city for that distinctive fire-brewed flavor. His son Julius took over. Then Julius's son Bernhard Jr., then Bernhard Jr.'s sons. 5 generations, each one expanding the brewery, modernizing the equipment, growing the distribution. But no matter how big the operation got, one thing never changed: the fire brewing process. Every batch, direct flame. It became Stroh's identity. Fire brewed since 1850 appeared on every bottle, every can, every advertisement. The brewery grew with Detroit. As Detroit exploded into America's automotive capital, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors all headquartered there, Stroh's became the city's beer. Auto workers finishing their shifts at the River Rouge plant would stop at corner bars for a Stroh's. Office workers, factory foremen, teachers, cops. It was Detroit in a glass. The workers who built Stroh's into a regional powerhouse weren't just employees. They were part of Detroit's industrial backbone. Men who'd immigrated from Poland, Germany, Italy, found work at the brewery, and stayed for life. The skills required weren't simple. Understanding fermentation temperatures, monitoring the fire brewing kettles, so the flame stayed consistent for hours. Reading the color and clarity of beer to know when a batch was ready. These weren't things you learned in a week. You apprenticed under someone who'd been doing it for 20 years. Prohibition shut them down from 1920 to 1933. Stroh's survived by making near beer, malt syrup, and ice cream. The family held on when dozens of other breweries went bankrupt and never reopened. When Prohibition ended, Stroh's was ready. Within months, they were brewing again. The loyal customers came back immediately. The 1940s and 50s were the golden years. Post-war prosperity, Detroit booming. Soldiers returning from World War II with steady paychecks and a taste for American beer. Stroh's expanded its brewery, modernized the bottling lines, built new warehouses. By 1950, they were producing over 500,000 barrels annually. By 1960, nearly 1 million. All of it fire brewed, all of it sold within a 300-mile radius of Detroit. And the workers, many of them second or third generation Stroh's employees, made good money. Union wages at a unionized brewery in a unionized city. A line worker could afford a house in a decent neighborhood. A car could send kids to college. The work was hard. Breweries were hot, loud, dangerous. But it was stable. Once you got hired at Stroh's, you didn't leave. You retired from Stroh's. Chapter 2. The Golden Years. If you worked at the Stroh Brewery in Detroit during the 1950s and 60s, you had one of the best jobs in the city. The pay was solid. The benefits were real. The overtime was plentiful. And most importantly, the work felt permanent. Men who started on the bottling line at age 20 expected to retire from the same brewery at 65. That wasn't hope. That was the plan. That was how it worked. Your grandfather started at Stroh's in 1925, worked the grain elevators for 40 years, retired with a pension. Your father started in 1948, ran the packaging line, same thing. And in 1968, you got hired. Same path, same security. The brewery ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Steam rising from the brew kettles. The smell of cooking malt hanging over the neighborhood. The sound of bottles clinking down conveyor belts. The constant movement of forklifts hauling pallets. Workers developed skills that took years to learn. How to monitor fermentation by smell and temperature. How to adjust the flame on the fire-brewed kettles so the temperature held steady within 2 degrees for hours. How to spot a bad batch before it made it to the bottling line. How to fix a jammed conveyor belt without shutting down the whole system. These weren't things you learned from a manual. You learned them standing next to someone who'd been doing it for 20 years. The work was hot and exhausting. Summer in a Detroit brewery, 100-degree heat from the kettles plus 90-degree heat from the weather, you'd come out soaked through with sweat. Winter was better for temperature but worse for the ice forming on loading dock floors. Men slipped and got hurt. Forklifts skidded. But you didn't complain much because the alternative was the auto plants, which were worse, or the steel mills, which were worse, or construction, which was seasonal. Families planned around the brewery schedule. Fathers working second shift missed dinner, but made it home to see kids before school in the morning. Fathers on third shift slept during the day while kids were at school, woke up when they got home. Mothers worked around it. Birthday parties on Sundays when dad was off. Christmas morning before the shift. Family vacations during the 2-week summer shutdown when the brewery closed for cleaning and maintenance. The neighborhoods around the Stroh Brewery were brewery neighborhoods. Streets where half the houses had at least one person working at Stroh's. Kids grew up knowing that's where their fathers went every day, where their grandfathers had gone. The brewery whistle marked time. Shift changes, lunch breaks, emergencies. You could set your watch by it. Corner bars stocked Stroh's on tap naturally, not just because it was local, but because the brewery workers drank there after their shifts. The brewery sponsored Little League teams, bowling leagues, company picnics at Belle Isle. Workers brought their families. Kids ran around while fathers drank Stroh's and talked shop. The union was strong. United Auto Workers represented the brewery workers, same as they represented auto plant workers across Detroit. When contracts came up for negotiation, the workers had leverage. Strikes were rare because both sides knew the deal. The company made money, the workers got paid well, everyone benefited. It was a stable arrangement that had worked for decades. The brewery was woven into Detroit's identity. When Stroh's sponsored the Detroit Tigers radio broadcasts, everyone listened. When the Stroh family donated to build parks or fund schools, the city appreciated it. When workers organized company bowling leagues and softball teams, half the neighborhood showed up to watch. By the 1970s, Stroh's was still Detroit's brewery, producing nearly 2 million barrels a year, employing over 2,000 people directly in Detroit plus hundreds more in distribution. Still family-owned, still fire-brewed, still Midwestern. But something was changing in the beer industry, something that would eventually destroy everything Stroh's had built. Chapter 3. The Beer Wars Begin. In the 1970s, two companies decided they were going to dominate American beer: Anheuser-Busch and Miller. Anheuser-Busch, makers of Budweiser, had always been one of the largest breweries in America. But in the 70s, they shifted strategy. Instead of just making beer and letting customers find it, they started spending massive amounts on national advertising. Television commercials during every major sporting event, billboards in every city, radio spots, print ads. The goal was simple: make Budweiser the default choice. Make it so ubiquitous that when someone walked into a bar and didn't know what to order, they'd just say Bud. It worked. Budweiser's market share grew steadily throughout the decade. By 1980, Anheuser-Busch controlled over 25% of all beer sold in America. Then Miller got aggressive. Philip Morris, the cigarette giant, bought Miller Brewing in 1969 and immediately started pouring money into it. In 1975, they launched Miller Lite, the first successful light beer. The advertising budget was staggering. Taste great, less filling became one of the most recognized slogans in America. Miller Lite exploded. Miller's overall market share jumped from around 4% in the early 70s to nearly 20% by 1980. The problem for every other brewery in America was simple: Anheuser-Busch and Miller were outspending them by orders of magnitude. A regional brewery like Stroh's might spend a couple $1 million a year on advertising, billboards in Michigan and Ohio, some radio spots, local sponsorships. Anheuser-Busch was spending $100 million. Miller was spending $60 million. The difference was absurd. What happened next was predictable. The big brands with big advertising budgets started taking market share from the regional brands. A bar in Toledo that used to carry 3 local beers and 2 national brands switched to 5 national brands and 1 local. Why? Because customers were asking for Bud and Miller. Because the distributor gave better pricing on the national brands. Because the tap handles were free if you stocked Budweiser. Regional breweries started dying. Across America, local brands that had been family-owned for generations went bankrupt or sold out to bigger competitors. Hamm's, Olympia, Rheingold, Schaefer, all gone. Consolidated into the portfolios of national players. Stroh's faced an impossible choice. They could stay regional, stick to Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and hope to survive by being the local favorite. But the big brands were taking that market anyway. Budweiser was everywhere. Miller was everywhere. Staying regional meant slow death, or they could try to go national, buy other breweries, expand distribution, advertise nationally, try to compete with Anheuser-Busch and Miller directly. But that required money they didn't have, capital investment they couldn't afford, distribution networks that took decades to build. The Stroh family agonized over this. The 5th generation was running the company now. Peter Stroh and his cousins, they'd grown up in the business. They understood that regional brewing was dying, but they also understood that trying to compete nationally against giants with unlimited resources was almost impossible. They decided to gamble. In 1981, Stroh's bought Schaefer Brewing Company, a failed New York brewery. It gave them East Coast distribution and production capacity. The acquisition was funded mostly with debt, but it seemed manageable. Then, in 1982, an opportunity appeared that seemed too good to pass up. The number 2 beer in America was for sale, a company that, if acquired, would make Stroh's the 3rd largest brewer in the country overnight. The deal that would finally let them compete with the big boys. The Stroh family said yes, and that decision destroyed the company. Chapter 4. The deal that killed them. In June 1982, Stroh Brewery Company announced they were acquiring the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company for approximately $545 million. Schlitz, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. The company that had been battling Budweiser for the number 1 spot for decades. One of the most recognized beer brands in America. And it was a disaster. A complete, total, catastrophic disaster. By 1982, Schlitz was a toxic brand. Just 6 years earlier, in 1976, Schlitz had been the number 2 beer in America, with about 14% of the market. Then the company tried to cut costs by changing the recipe and using cheaper ingredients. The result was beer that customers hated. Sales collapsed. Schlitz's market share dropped from 14% to about 8%. Angry customers, furious distributors, a poisoned brand. Stroh's knew this. They did their due diligence. They saw the numbers. They knew Schlitz was a failing company, but they convinced themselves it was fixable. The Stroh family believed that Schlitz's problems were management problems, not product problems. Fix the beer, rebuild the brand, restore the quality, and you'd have the number 2 beer in America again. What they didn't fully understand or didn't want to see was how deeply Schlitz had damaged itself. The brand was beyond saving. Customers who had abandoned Schlitz for Budweiser or Miller weren't coming back. The distribution network was fractured. The breweries were old and inefficient. The debt Schlitz was carrying was crushing. But the real problem was how Stroh's paid for the acquisition. $545 million. Stroh's didn't have that money, so they borrowed almost all of it. Leveraged buyout. The acquired company's assets served as collateral for the loans. It was a massive, risky financial maneuver. The moment the deal closed, Stroh's balance sheet went from healthy to terrifying. The debt service, the interest payments alone, was enormous. Every month, Stroh's had to pay millions in interest before they could invest a single dollar in marketing, equipment upgrades, or product development. Workers at the Detroit brewery heard about the acquisition and felt uneasy. This didn't feel right. Stroh's had always been conservative, family-owned, careful. Borrowing $500 million to buy a collapsing competitor felt reckless, dangerous. Like the family was betting everything on one hand. The union reps asked questions. What does this mean for our jobs? What does this mean for the Detroit brewery? Management gave reassuring answers. This makes us stronger. This gives us national scale. This secures everyone's future. But the workers weren't convinced. They'd seen what happened to Schlitz workers: layoffs, plant closures, broken promises. But management was optimistic publicly. Press releases talked about the synergies, the combined distribution networks, the economies of scale. The Stroh family genuinely believed they could turn Schlitz around. They couldn't. And within 2 years, the problems became obvious. Chapter 5. Drowning in Debt. The numbers started going wrong almost immediately. Stroh's had borrowed over $500 million to buy Schlitz. The interest on that debt was roughly $50 to $60 million per year. That meant before Stroh's could spend a single dollar on marketing, on upgrading breweries, on developing new products, they had to make $50 million just to service the debt. And Schlitz wasn't generating the cash they expected. The brand was worse than Stroh's had estimated. Customers didn't want it. Bars didn't want to stock it. Distributors pushed back. Schlitz's sales continued dropping even after the acquisition. Instead of buying a revenue stream, Stroh's had bought a money pit. By 1984, Stroh's was in serious trouble. They were losing market share. Their debt was crushing them. And Anheuser, Busch, and Miller kept growing. Budweiser and Miller Lite were dominating bars, stores, and advertising. Stroh's couldn't compete on marketing spend because all their money went to debt payments. The only option was cost-cutting. Stroh's started consolidating breweries. They closed Schlitz's old Milwaukee plant, the flagship brewery where Schlitz had been made for over 100 years. 1,300 jobs gone. They closed facilities in Brooklyn and Los Angeles. More jobs gone. They merged operations to cut overhead, laid off workers, reduced shifts. Detroit brewery workers watched nervously. Their brewery was still running, still profitable, but the layoffs happening elsewhere made everyone uneasy. Men with 20 or 30 years at Stroh's started worrying for the first time in their careers. Was their brewery next? The rumors spread through the factory floor. Someone heard from a cousin who worked at the Milwaukee plant that management was looking at closing Detroit next. Someone else heard they were selling off the Tampa brewery. Nobody knew what was true. Management wasn't talking. The union couldn't get straight answers. Workers started making backup plans. Younger employees with 10 or 15 years in started looking for other jobs just in case. Older workers nearing retirement, men in their 50s with 35 years at Stroh's, were trapped. Too old to start over somewhere else. Too young to retire. They needed 5 more years, maybe 10, to get full pension. All they could do was show up, do their jobs, and hope the brewery stayed open long enough. The company tried desperate measures to generate cash. They discontinued unprofitable beer brands. They sold off assets. They cut advertising budgets even further. They raised prices slightly, which drove away more customers. Everything they did made the situation worse. By the late 1980s, Stroh's was trapped. They couldn't pay down the debt because they weren't profitable enough. They couldn't become profitable because they couldn't invest in marketing or innovation. All the money went to debt service. They couldn't sell Schlitz because nobody wanted to buy a dying brand. And they couldn't sell Stroh's because the family wouldn't let go. Market share kept dropping. 1982. Combined Stroh's and Schlitz had about 13% of the market. 1985, 10%. 1988, 7%. Every year they lost ground to Anheuser, Busch, and Miller. Workers started leaving. Younger employees saw what was happening and found jobs elsewhere before the layoffs came. Experienced workers nearing retirement stayed, hoping to make it 5 more years, 10 more years, to full pension. But everyone felt it. The company wasn't stable anymore. The Detroit brewery that had run 3 shifts for decades cut back to 2 shifts, then back to 1. Production dropped. Fewer workers needed. The men who got laid off, 40-year-olds who'd worked there since high school, who had mortgages and kids in college, walked out the gates with severance packages that didn't come close to replacing their wages. And then, in 1996, the Stroh family made the same mistake again. Chapter 6. The Desperate Gamble. In 1996, Stroh's acquired the G. Heilemann Brewing Company for $300 million. Heilemann was another failed regional brewery based in Wisconsin, had acquired dozens of smaller breweries over the years and stitched them together into a portfolio of regional brands: Old Style, Rainier, Lone Star, Schmitz. The company had gone bankrupt. Stroh's bought it out of bankruptcy. It was the same playbook, the same strategy, the same mistake. Buy a failing competitor. Take on massive debt to do it. Hope the combined scale will finally let you compete with Anheuser, Busch, and Miller. It hadn't worked with Schlitz. There was no reason to think it would work with Heilemann. Workers at the Detroit brewery couldn't believe it. They'd watched the company struggle for 14 years under the weight of the Schlitz debt. They'd watched layoffs and plant closures. They'd watched Stroh's market share shrink year after year. And now management was doing it again. Taking on more debt, buying another failing company, doubling down on a strategy that had already nearly destroyed them. The shop floor conversations turned bitter. "They're going to kill us. This is the end. We should have gotten out years ago." Workers who'd defended management, who'd believed the company would turn around, stopped believing. This wasn't a recovery plan. This was desperation. The Heilemann acquisition made Stroh's the third largest brewer in America by volume. Again, just like the Schlitz acquisition had in 1982. And just like with Schlitz, the problem started immediately. Heilemann's brands were weak. The breweries were old and inefficient. The distribution networks were fragmented. And the debt, combined with the remaining Schlitz debt, Stroh's was now carrying close to $1 billion in obligations. For a company generating maybe $100 million in annual operating profit, that was a death sentence. The Stroh family was losing control of their own company. The debt holders had more say than the family did. Banks dictated strategy. Cost-cutting became the only priority. Any plan that required investment, new marketing campaigns, product innovation, brewery upgrades, was off the table. There was no money. Everything went to debt service. By 1997, it was obvious to everyone that Stroh's couldn't survive. The company was too leveraged. The brands were too weak. The competition was too strong. Anheuser, Busch, and Miller had won the beer wars. The regional breweries were dead or dying. And Stroh's was bleeding out. Workers showed up every day and did their jobs, but the fear was constant. When would the announcement come? When would the brewery close? When would they get told to go home and not come back? Chapter 7. The End. On February 8, 1999, the Stroh family made an announcement. After 149 years of family ownership, they were selling the Stroh Brewery Company. Not selling to another brewery, selling for parts. Pabst Brewing Company agreed to buy the Stroh's, Schlitz, and Old Milwaukee brands. Miller Brewing bought the Heilemann brands, Old Style, Lone Star, Rainier, and others. The breweries themselves would be closed. The equipment would be sold. The distribution networks would be dismantled. The Detroit brewery would shut down. The Tampa brewery would shut down. The Memphis brewery would shut down. Winston-Salem would shut down. Every facility, all of them. 5,000 jobs, gone. Workers at the Detroit brewery heard the news and felt numb. It had been coming for years, but hearing it was still a shock. 149 years. 5 generations of the Stroh family, thousands of workers who'd spent their entire careers there. Over, just like that. A 58-year-old man who'd started at the brewery at age 21, 37 years on the job, walked out the gates knowing his pension would be a fraction of what he'd been promised. He'd planned his whole retirement around that full pension. House paid off, grandkids' college fund started, maybe a small place up north. Now, he'd be working part-time somewhere just to make ends meet. A 43-year-old woman who'd worked in the office managing payroll and benefits for 18 years got 2 weeks severance. 18 years, 2 weeks. She had a mortgage, 2 kids in high school, a car payment. 2 weeks wouldn't even cover 1 month's expenses. Men who had 40 years at the brewery were told there would be no pensions. The pension fund was underfunded. The company was bankrupt. Workers would get a fraction of what they'd been promised. A man who'd started at age 22 and worked until he was 62, 40 years, would retire with maybe 30% of his expected pension. Not enough to live on. Not close. The severance packages were minimal. A few weeks of pay for most workers. Some got nothing. The union fought, but there was no money to fight over. When a company goes bankrupt, workers are the last ones paid. Creditors come first. Bondholders come first. Banks come first. Workers get what's left. And there wasn't much left. The Detroit brewery closed in March 1999. Workers who'd clocked in every day for 20, 30, 40 years walked out the gates for the last time. Some of them cried. Some were angry. Most were just tired. They'd seen it coming. The writing had been on the wall since the Schlitz acquisition in 1982. The final shift was surreal. The machines were turned off one by one. The conveyor belt stopped. The kettles went cold. Men who'd spent decades maintaining that equipment, keeping it running, walked through the silent factory one last time. 30 years of muscle memory, knowing exactly where to step, which valve to turn, how to fix that one temperamental machine, suddenly worthless. The building sat empty for years. Equipment was auctioned off. The copper kettles that had fire-brewed beer for generations were sold for scrap. The loading docks where trucks had lined up for decades stood silent. Grass grew through cracks in the parking lot. Windows got broken and never fixed. Families who'd built their lives around brewery paychecks struggled. 55-year-old men with 20 years' experience in a brewery couldn't find work that paid anywhere close to what they'd made. They ended up at Home Depot or driving forklifts at warehouses for half their old wage. Wives who hadn't worked in years went back to work to make up the difference. College funds disappeared. Retirements got postponed indefinitely. The neighborhoods around the brewery suffered. When 5,000 people lose their jobs, the ripple effects spread. Bars closed because customers couldn't afford to drink anymore. Stores closed because nobody was buying. Tax revenue dropped. Detroit, already struggling from the auto industry's decline, took another hit it couldn't afford. The Stroh family walked away. They'd lost the company, but they didn't lose everything. The family still had wealth, real estate, investments, other business interests. They weren't going to be working at Home Depot. The workers, though, they lost everything: jobs, pensions, futures. And the brand? The Stroh's name still exists. Pabst owns it. It's contract brewed at random facilities. The beer you buy today with a Stroh's label has nothing to do with the fire-brewed tradition that started in 1850. It's not made in Detroit. It's not made by Stroh's. It's just a name on a can. Chapter 8. The Lesson. Stroh's didn't die because they made bad beer. They didn't die because customers stopped drinking. They didn't die because of prohibition or war or economic collapse. Stroh's survived all of that. Stroh's died because of debt. Debt from ambition. Debt from the desperate attempt to compete in a market they'd already lost. When the Stroh family bought Schlitz in 1982, they borrowed money they couldn't pay back to buy a company they couldn't fix. The interest on that debt strangled them for 17 years. Every dollar that could have gone to marketing, innovation, or quality improvement went to banks instead. The company couldn't grow because it couldn't invest. It couldn't invest because it was drowning. The comparison to breweries that survived is stark. Yuengling, America's oldest brewery, stayed regional. Family-owned, stayed in Pennsylvania. Grew slowly, never took on massive debt, never tried to compete nationally with Anheuser Busch. They're still here, still family-owned, still profitable. Sam Adams started in 1984, just 2 years after Stroh's bought Schlitz, built slowly, stayed craft, stayed regional for years before expanding, never tried to be Budweiser. They're still here, still independent, still growing. Stroh's tried to be something they weren't, tried to compete at a scale they couldn't afford, and the debt killed them. Detroit lost another anchor employer. After the auto industry's decline devastated the city in the 1970s and 80s. Losing Stroh's was another blow the city couldn't absorb. 5,000 good manufacturing jobs, gone. The tax base shrunk. The neighborhoods declined further. And here's the final irony. The Stroh's brand still exists. You can still buy Stroh's beer. It's on shelves at grocery stores. It's brewed under contract by Pabst at random facilities around the country. But it's not Detroit beer. It's not fire brewed. It's not made by workers who learned the craft from their fathers and grandfathers. It's just a name, a ghost, a reminder of what used to be. The beer exists without the brewery. The brand exists without the soul. That's what's left of 149 years of Stroh family brewing. A label on a can, nothing more. So here's what I want to know. Did you drink Stroh's, the real Stroh's, fire brewed in Detroit? Did you work at the brewery? Detroit, Memphis, Tampa? Did your father work there? Were you one of the workers who walked out those gates in 1999? Do you remember when Stroh's was everywhere in the Midwest? When it was Detroit's beer? And here's the question. Did you notice when it started to go wrong? Could you tell the company was in trouble before the end came? Leave a comment. Tell me your Stroh's story. If this story hit you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who remembers. Subscribe for more stories about American companies that lost everything. And check out my video on Schlitz Brewing Company, because Stroh's bought them, and that decision destroyed both companies.